On the one hand, Dr. Manter suggested that we might try to manage plants and soil to get the kind of microbiome that would promote the kind of crop and crop growth that we want and need for people to consume or use in one way or another. On the other hand, Dr. Stefan, you said that 10 to 30% of the DNA sequences from soil or humans are unknown. So I guess what I'd like to hear you speculate on are what are the unintended consequences? If we try to manage human health by managing soil health, and it affects the microbiome, what are some of the unintended consequences of that? For example, and here's a question that I don't know the answer to, and I hope you do. Are there any soil microbes that any of you know of that are pathogens of both plants and humans?
The same strains, species. I think we need, is that on? We need more fetal pigs is what we need. What was that? I don't know of any, and I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know of any strains that are common across the two, but within some bacterial species, anyway.
Forgive me that I cannot remember the name of the particular microbe, but actually there is at least a particular study that I've read that there are actually common pathogens to human and plant. But I have to apologize that I cannot remember the name of the species at that moment. But I have a comment about this question, and I will tell you about a study that looked at even two different plant pathogens, soil-borne pathogens, Fusarium and another species that causes black root rot, which is called the alleviate. And even just to manage these two, what control measures that would control the black root rot pathogen and reduce it will increase the Fusarium, which will cause another disease.
All the other diseases.
Okay, so here we just talk about two organisms, yeah? Now what about, we are looking at millions and billions of different organisms. Obviously, by trying to manipulate one, you would have different effect on the other. Let alone if you want to try and control entire microbiomes. I think this is an enormous challenge. And that brings us to one of the comments about function. One of the things that a lot of people that work on at least on the soil and plant microbiomes nowadays are starting to look more at functional groups rather than looking at at particular species. So the idea nowadays is let's try to have the right functional groups in the soil. For example, those that cycle nutrients, particular nitrogen or carbon, those that produce those what we heard about today, the plant growth hormones. Have them thrive in the rhizosphere, but less trying to control particular species, try to control functions rather than species. So.
Well, going back to the first question of plant pathogens and human pathogens, the only example I can think of is like in small grains when you get smuts and rusts in those types of fungi that produce aflatoxins, they can directly impact human health.
Yeah. Yeah. I can think of one. I don't remember the species. It's also a fusarium. For those of you who aren't, fusarium is a type of microscopic fungus, and it's a tropical thing. It's not soil-borne though. It's foliar, and people that walk through plants stands that are infected with it, it apparently is capable of getting established on the cornea of the eye. But that's not a soil-borne thing. So I don't know of any soil-borne ones. There's a Pseudomonas? Well, that's not surprising, is there? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a Google exercise. Well, here's one for Carl that came up. It's sort of a specific one. Carl, yeah. And you mentioned antibiotic molecules out in soil and in the environment. How do bioactive antibiotic molecules get out there in the first place?
Sure. So I think I touched on it a little bit. And usually when I give this talk, I have this really beautiful, I call it my cow pie chart. It's just a circular cow pie that I've split up into showing how much antibiotics stay with the cow and how much gets passed through.
Is this out of your freezer? Or is this?
Yeah. Should have brought it. It gets a lot of laughs. But so a lot of the antibiotics that are given to livestock pass through the livestock. So the antibiotic will be present in manure or urine. Which is why I collect all that manure and urine and throw it onto soils and see what happens. And another thing that came up earlier was we were talking about compost as a prevention or as a way to treat livestock manure that maybe has pathogens or antibiotics in it. And what I find interesting, and is maybe a possible another research question, or maybe a smaller one compared to a lot of the other ones that have been thrown out, is so we see very few antibiotics actually in the manure we find. We run the manure through mass specs and find nearly no antibiotics. It depends on the antibiotic and the livestock and all of that. But what we do see is the result of those antibiotics. We see that the microbes are upregulating antibiotic-resistant genes and are functioning differently than they would have they not been exposed to antibiotics. So even though the antibiotics aren't there, we're still seeing the effect of those antibiotics. So the fact that composting is reducing the antibiotic load means one thing. I don't know that it means that the effect on function, microbial function, is also reduced. That might be worth looking into.
So that's antibiotics, but can we ask the same sort of questions about different kinds of pesticides? So pesticides are intentionally put out there. What do we know about how those are affecting microbial communities in the environment? And is there any evidence that these are affecting microbial community function?
I was talking with somebody earlier. So the pesticide question is more outside of my wheelhouse. But I was joking with it was Jason earlier, actually. It was in the last panel. That all you have to do really is brush take a feather and brush the soil, and you'll see a difference in the microbial community because it's so plastic and it's so easily changeable. So my thought would be, and again, this is with having zero background research in pesticides, that you would see an effect. But again, that's with no background on pesticide use. So.
Let me take a look here. Dan, can you take a minute or two and just talk about how soil microbes affect how plants resist disease? What are the different things going on there about how soil microbes help plants resist disease?
Sure. Split it up into two major groups, just for here. Direct microbe interactions. So there's going on in the soil. Either whether it's a microbe that's parasitic on another or releasing compounds, reducing its growth in the soil. And then the area of research of plant microbe interactions is much more wide open, but everything from different defense reactions to basically any step of disease, we can probably find a microbe that's going to affect it. And that's as general as I want to be right now.
Well, we're coming up just on the end of our time for this session, but there was a comment. This is not a question, but I'll end with a comment that came in for this panel. It said, I just came to the realization that we are not actually human, but simply hosts for the propagation and dissemination of our microbiological communities, our microbiomes. I guess you could take that further and you'd say, well, we move microbes and we feed microbes and we entertain microbes, so we're kind of the cruise ships of the microbiological world. So I think we'll probably ought to end with that thought. And I want to thank this panel for a really thought-provoking